Good morning. We'll call this meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Gehrig. Pepcorn.
Here.
Preston. Here. Strand.
Here.
Mahoney.
Here. This is an appeal hearing for Justin Nacciatillo. This is a special city commissioner meeting to hear the appeal of Justin Nacciatillo, former police officer of the Fargo Police Department. On February 8th and 11th, the Civil Service Commission heard Mr. Nacciatillo's appeal and found his termination was for cause and was not motivated by political or other improper considerations. The Civil Service Commission upheld Justin Nacciatillo's termination of employment. While the power of disciplinary action or discharge rests with the appointing authority, the role of the Civil Service Commission in a hearing process is to ensure that such disciplinary actions are not motivated by political or other improper considerations. Upon the appeal to the City Commission is charged with hearing the appeal testimony, asking for any additional questions we might have, and taking a determination as to whether the findings and conclusions of the Civil Service Commission stand. There is a 2-hour time limit in this hearing. In addition, the City Commission will not be accepting any new materials or witnesses. As a reminder, occasionally parties involved in a hearing may provide written documents that contain information about a disability or medical condition. Commissioners are reminded to refer to this information only in general terms such as a disability or medical condition, and not specifically reference or name the disability or condition. It is the decision of the aggrieved party as to whether they choose to specifically disclose and discuss their disability or medical condition during the public appeal hearings. Additionally, the documents we receive at this hearing must not be released by the City Commission. The City will respond to any open record requests through the normal open request. Procedure for today's hearing is as follows. Both parties, appointed authority and aggrieved party, may exercise the right to have representation participate in the hearing. The Commission would like to have all parties speak personally to the issues as well. Parties and/or the representatives will not be able to directly question witnesses for the opposing party. So the format today is outlined. What we're going to start now is an opening statement by the employee and representative.
Mayor Mahoney, my name is Leo Wilking. I'm the attorney for Officer Nacciatillo. To my real chagrin and embarrassment, I find that I did not pull a document from my printer at the office before coming down here, which I really do need. And so, with your permission, and this 3 minutes can be taken out of my 50 minutes, I need to have someone scan and email it to me. So it should only be 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you.
Katie, can our team help him get copies?
This is not evidence.
Oh.
This is just my opening statement.
Oh, okay.
Mayor, does he have access to a printer or need one?
That's why I say Katie can help him out if he needs it. Just, Katie, make sure he understands that.
I apologize again, Mr. Mayor, and I'm ready to proceed.
Are you ready to proceed?
Yes.
Okay, you're up.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Commission, Officer Nachitello and I appreciate your taking the time today to hear his appeal from the finding of the Civil Service Commission, which affirmed my client's termination from the Fargo Police Department after a hearing on February 8. I'm of two minds regarding this hearing. On the one hand, I'm pleased that Officer Nachitello has the opportunity to defend his actions as a police officer serving this community for almost 19 years, and to explain his actions in the two incidents that gave rise to his termination. But I'm also disappointed that we're here, because I think it could and should have been avoided because of developments which occurred after the Civil Service Commission hearing. One of those developments was that the North Dakota Peace Officers Standards and Training Board sent a letter to Chief Zabalski in late March, finding that Officer Nachitello had not engaged in any willfully, intentionally violation of standards, and therefore it would take no action regarding his law enforcement privileges. When I pointed this out to the city attorney, Nancy Morris, she said it didn't matter, wasn't relevant. The other new development, and it's uncomfortable for me to suggest that another attorney did not comply with ethical guidelines, but Ms. Morris and I had an exchange of letters in April in which Officer Nachitello offered to resign and not pursue this appeal and not seek any lost earnings, compensatory damages, not pursue any further litigation for what we believe was very likely a violation of his constitutional right of due process. He was willing to walk away. All he wanted was that the department withdraw its allegations that he had lied, misrepresented evidence, committed offenses that justified termination. So there are 4 letters at issue, and I'll talk about them. I wrote a letter proposing that type of settlement April 5. Ms. Morris responded April 7. I wrote another letter April 21, and in that letter, I specifically, well, let me first say that when I wrote the letter on April 5th, indicating that Officer Nachitello would resign if the termination violations were withdrawn, she responded in an email on that date saying, "I'm in receipt of your email and attachment. I will present it to the city and be back in touch." In my follow-up letter of April 21, which responded to Ms. Morris's letter indicating that the city would withdraw 3 of the 5 termination offenses based on performance, but not the 2 related to efficiency, I specifically asked that she share this offer with the mayor and with the city commission. She refused to do so. And she said in her letter of April 28th, "You've appealed your client's termination to the city commission as provided by ordinance. As such, the governing body will be presented with the evidence considered by the Civil Service Commission, and additional testimony and arguments will be permitted. Because the city commission has a unique role in decision-making with regard to employment matters, the decision has been made that your letter will not be shared with the mayor and commissioners in favor of ensuring compliance with open meeting laws, transparency, and integrity in the process." I have no idea what she means by that. Integrity of the process? You are the deciding body in this case. She has an obligation to communicate settlement offers to her client. It is not, when she said she would communicate my offer to the city, I did not mean communicate it to Dave Zabolski and let him decide, but that's apparently what happened, because it wasn't shared with you, which prompted me to take the unusual step of bringing this up with the media. I think that you five, had you been aware that my client would resign and seek no further recourse in this matter, would have said, fine, let's do it. Let's get this done. You didn't have that chance, which I think is very regrettable. But you have that chance today. And I can explain why I think you should take that opportunity. Because the standard, as the mayor has just indicated, is whether there were political or other improper considerations in the decision to terminate. And I believe we have persuasive evidence that there was one, improper consideration because due process was denied, and number two, political considerations. Just as an overview, I'll remind you briefly about Officer Nocitello's history. Officer Nocitello joined the Fargo Police Department in January 2003. He was deployed to Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom in December 2003. He served his country in Iraq honorably until March of 2005. He was in combat. He did see fellow soldiers die, and his service had profound consequences in terms of his mental health. The VA discharged him honorably, but said he did have service-related disabilities, including depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. But notwithstanding those conditions, Officer Nocitello wanted to resume his employment by the Fargo Police Department and continue his service to the people of Fargo. And he did so. And over the next 16 years, he served as a patrol officer. He did investigations. He was a detective, and he was, again, a patrol officer. In those, I think, nearly 19 years of total service, Officer Nocitello did not have one sustained complaint against him, not one. No discipline. So it's hard to understand why, after 19 years, he is terminated based on what happened with a possibly stolen car, which was recovered within a couple days, and two missing juveniles who were found to be with their mother, as Officer Nocitello believed to be the case from the very beginning. But notwithstanding the very good outcome in both those cases, notwithstanding the fact that the officer who assisted my client in the recovery of the abandoned vehicle praised his performance. The parents of the missing juveniles praised his performance. The owner of the abandoned car was very happy with my client's professionalism. Notwithstanding all that, he's out of a job. It's hard to understand. So I'll let my client explain the issue of the missing evidence, but essentially, as I said, there were 5 policy violations which resulted in a recommendation of termination. Ms. Morris and the city agreed to withdraw 3 of those 5. The 2 remaining ones were based on, quote, efficiency, and had to do with what happened to evidence recovered from the abandoned vehicle. And Mr. Notchtillo, Officer Notchtillo, freely admits he mistakenly discarded an empty can of root beer or Coke or something that was found in the car that the owner did not believe he had put there. That was an accidental mistake on his part, and he takes full responsibility for it. But over the years, he has logged in properly, not hundreds, but thousands of items of evidence. Not one complaint, not one problem with any of those over 19 years. But because he accidentally discards a pop can and doesn't remember being given a sock, the city is willing to terminate his employment and not allow him to resign. So again, I'll let Officer Notchtillo discuss the details of the evidence. But what I want to talk about in more detail is what happened with the pre-termination proceedings on November 29th and December 1. The United States Supreme Court, in the Loudermill case, and the Fargo Police Department, in its policy 1009.12, provide that a public employee, a government employee, such as Officer Notchtillo, has a property interest in his job, and he is entitled to due process before termination. And the policy in question, 1009.12, was included in my letter to Ms. Morris of April 5th. And it says in part, the pre-discipline process is intended to provide the accused employee with an opportunity to present a written or oral response to the chief of police after having had an opportunity to review the supporting materials and prior to the imposition of any recommended discipline. The response is not intended to be an adversarial formal hearing, but employees should be treated with courtesy and respect at all times. The employee may suggest further investigation could be conducted, and so forth. Clearly, according to policy, Officer Notchtillo, prior to termination, was entitled to notice of the charges and allegations against him, the potential discipline, and an opportunity to respond. The initial pre-determination meeting on November 29th was fairly short. He was not given any allegations of policy violations. He was not given any notice that his job might be terminated. Instead, he asked for further investigation, that additional people be interviewed, and the chief agreed to do that, and the predetermination meeting was continued until December 1, 2021. At that meeting of December 1, 2021, and the video was shown to the Civil Service Commission, it's a meeting that lasts about 20 minutes. and the first 16 or 17 minutes are taken up with Chief Zabolski reading the list of alleged policy violations, the alleged recommendation of discipline, and then he asks if there are any questions. And the first thing out of my client's mouth is, and I quote, I'm not going to take the time to play that video. You have the opportunity to watch it. Officer Nacciatillo does have a question. He says, quote, "Is it your belief I intentionally disposed of those items of evidence," referring to the sock and the empty pop can. And Chief Zabolski responds, "This is not the place to debate what has happened." My client wasn't looking for debate. He wanted a chance to explain. He wasn't given that chance. And one of the two charges that would result in termination, according to Chief Zabolski, was whether Officer Nacciatillo had concealed, attempted to conceal, remove, or destroy defective or incompetent work. So clearly, whether my client had intentionally destroyed evidence or discarded evidence was a relevant consideration. But Chief Zabolski says, and I quote, "It's not a relevant question." Not relevant? How can it not be relevant when he's accused of intentionally destroying evidence? But he wasn't allowed to explain. This is not the time and place for debate. Really, Chief? It's my understanding, and the Chief can correct me if I'm wrong, that this was the first officer he had terminated since taking his position in October 2019. I don't know whether the Chief had read Policy 1009.12. Was he aware of it? But he should have been aware of it, and he either wasn't aware of it or he deliberately ignored it, because he did not give my client a chance to respond to the allegations. And that was his right, his constitutionally protected right of due process. So if my client was terminated in violation of Department Policy 1009.12 because his due process constitutional rights were violated, then that is an improper consideration leading to termination. And then the issue of the settlement discussions. We're at a point where the city recognized that it probably didn't have the evidence or the ability to sustain 3 of the 5 terminable offenses. So what it's left with is the 2 concerning the disposed of evidence. And one of those was number 4 of the complaint involving the abandoned vehicle, and I indicated that involves concealing, attempting to conceal, destroying defective or incompetent work. The other one was not processing or logging evidence properly. And apparently that's also a terminable offense for a 19-year veteran. So I said in my second letter to Ms. Morris, there's no basis for termination on those 2 counts. Efficiency. My client will resign, but he does not believe he should be terminated for accidentally discarding of evidence which may or may not have been significant. The car was recovered. It was restored to the owner. But the city refused. Or was it the city? Was it Chief Zabolski who refused? Because his ego demanded that there be termination, not resignation. And What I'm about to say is speculation, but it does suggest political considerations. You are all aware that after the riot in downtown Fargo, following the death, the murder of George Floyd, activists in this community began to have regular meetings with the chief regarding police accountability, rooting out bad cops, corruption. And those activists were in attendance at the Civil Service Commission meeting, and they were active on Facebook during that meeting, saying, yeah, this is great, we're going to get rid of this bad cop, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wonder, did Chief Cebulski feel, well, here's an example of someone. I can make an example of Officer Nachitillo, and I can offer him as a sacrifice, as a scapegoat to these activists who want me to root out bad cops. Really? Bad cops? This 19-year veteran who served with distinction in Iraq, a bad cop? Absolutely not. I think the termination was politically motivated. Chief Cebulski, of course, will deny it. But the facts are the facts. A 19-year veteran with no prior sustained disciplinary complaints is terminated for discarding a pop can. The pop can and the sock, really that's redundant because the DNA could have been retrieved from either one. The penalty does not fit the crime. And so, number one, violation of due process. You should reverse the termination, or at least allow my client to resign. And you have that power. You are the city, not Chief Cebulski, not City Attorney Nancy Morris. You are the city of Fargo. And you have the power to allow my client to resign and walk away. And I urge you to do that. So I think that concludes my opening remarks. And I think I'd next ask Officer Nachitillo to talk about this abandoned vehicle. I mean, originally believed to be stolen. It ended up in some field somewhere. It was discovered by a deputy sheriff from Cass County. It's not denied, it's not disputed, that my client asked the deputy sheriff, please contact the owner and find out if there's anything in that car that he doesn't think belonged to him. And the deputy sheriff says, I'll do that. He does that. And he reports back to Officer Nachitillo, yeah, the owner of the car thinks that there's a sock and a can of root beer or Coke, which he didn't put there. Well, Officer Nachitillo says, I think I should have those because I can swab them for DNA and we can put a trace on the results. And I guess I'll let Officer Nachitillo take it from there. But deliberately concealing or destroying evidence, why would he deliberately destroy evidence that he's asked for? It doesn't make any sense. It's nonsensical. He asked for the evidence, and then he deliberately throws it away? What? Why? What's his motive? Zero. So, again, Officer Nachitillo, in that December 1 meeting, you asked the chief.
Excuse me, out of order, actually, the opening statement of the appointing authority is next, and then the employee.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's your attention.
We can question the officer later.
Yeah, and now we have an opening statement by appointing authority representative. Nancy Morris is going to start that, is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm going to start with, I am disappointed by what I've heard today from Mr. Wilking. Suffice it to say that I disagree with everything he has argued today with respect to Officer Nachitillo's employment with respect to my involvement in the discussions and with respect to Chief Sobolski's motivations in making the decision that he made as a result of Officer Nachitilo's performance. With that, I want to indicate that I stand by my decision to not provide the City Commission, after consultation with the mayor, the Assistant City Administrator, Chief Sobolski, and Human Resources, the settlement discussions and negotiations that took place. It would have been inappropriate, in my opinion, and a violation of the open meeting laws to bring to this body one piece of the entire story without having an executive session at which you could have voted as to whether or not to accept the settlement discussion, and then addressed the issue of then how do you hear an appeal without having had that process be tainted. So yes, it is before you today if you wish to consider resignation, as Mr. Wilking has argued. I would encourage you not to consider that under the circumstances. We have a process. The evidence will be presented to you for the decision as to whether or not the appointing authority acted in a manner that was for improper considerations or politically motivated. I submit to you that the termination of Officer Nachitilo was for cause. You will hear testimony that it was entirely appropriate for the appointing authority to make this decision with the facts and circumstances as Chief Sobolski knew at the time, and further, by recommendation of his executive staff, Captain Vinson and Assistant Chief Travis Stevanovitz. It was a full and fair investigation and opportunity. I will also address the due process questions. We did indicate that we would be willing to, as a recommendation of staff, to withdraw 3 of the 5 counts that related to untruthfulness and resulted in termination. The 2 counts continue, and I will tell you further information that those counts are well supported by the evidence and that the decision of Chief Sobolski was proper under the circumstances. Again, the role of the Civil Service Commission is to ensure that the disciplinary actions are not motivated by political or other improper considerations, but the power of that disciplinary action rests squarely on the shoulders of the appointing authority. The city does not take lightly its responsibility in employment matters, and this decision was not made lightly. It was the decision of the appointing authority to terminate Officer Nachitilo's employment, and I submit to you again, it was not improper, it was not politically motivated, it was for cause, and I encourage you to uphold that decision of the appointing authority and affirm the decision of the Civil Service Commission. I will give you a brief summary. By way of summary, complaint 21046 involved a report of a call of a stolen vehicle. Officer Nachitilo did not go to the scene of the report of the stolen vehicle. He suggested that the person calling essentially undertake their own investigation, find out whether the vehicle had been towed, and if so, to let him know. He had no follow-up. He did not investigate that call. He then, 2 days later, when the car was discovered, he did talk to the sheriff, the deputy that had discovered the vehicle, and asked him to see if there was any evidence. There's no question that Officer Nachitilo had served as a detective. That was something that he was aware should be done. He did secure that evidence, and at some point, 2 days later that he made, the day of the discovery, is when he filed the report for the stolen vehicle. Simultaneously, he indicated he will do DNA swab evidence on the evidence, and at the same time, suggested that the case file should be filed inactive. He knew at that time he did not have that evidence. He suggested in his report that it should be filed inactive. Not until 30 days later does he indicate that the evidence is no longer available due to his having thrown it away. There was no suggestion that his throwing it away was intentional. It is the request to file it inactive and then not disclosing the reason for that until 30 days later, in which he asked that the report continue to be filed as inactive. So that's the evidence with respect to 046, which is the stolen vehicle case. Officer Nachatilo's conduct with respect to 21047, which is the missing children case, is alarming, concerning, and would be cause for termination, whether or not Chief Sobalski identified that count. In total, the staff recommendation, the executive staff recommendation, was termination as a result of Officer Nachatilo's conduct. Talking about 047, this was a call that came from the West Fargo SRO school when a parent appeared at the school and said, the children are gone. There's 2 children, 8 and 12, that have been taken from their home, did not appear at school, and that's a high priority case. And Officer Nachatilo knows that. He knows that there is, by state statute, a form that needs to be presented into a national database that these children are missing. And he does not do that. He arrives at the school, he talks to the West Fargo officer, knowing that this is a Fargo case and Fargo is primary, and this is his responsibility. He cannot shirk that responsibility. There are 2 children missing. He does not file that form. He simply failed to perform on the assumption, and he testified to this, that he believed that the biological mother of the children may have picked up the kids from the home, wanting to spend time with them. She did not have the authority to do that. She wanted to see the kids. She took the children to Minneapolis. 6 hours later, it is confirmed that in fact the children are with the biological mother. At that point, it was unknown for sure where those children were. Based on his assumption, 6 hours later, they had confirmed with the biological mother. 6 hours, that is a harrowing length of time, and makes me shudder, frankly. There have been previous complaints regarding Officer Nachatilo's performance. Those complaints were not sustained due to mental health conditions that Officer Nachatilo did place into evidence at issue. The determination was made to return him to duty after a fitness for duty test and some further evaluation. And at that time, when he was returned to duty on March 21st, so that complaint was already pending before Chief Sobalski even started his employment. He was returned to full duty, and Chief Sobalski visited with Officer Nachatilo and made his performance requirements clear at the time. He would need to perform. There were performance deficiencies. He was returned to full duty, complaint not sustained, but expectations of performance are entirely appropriate by the appointing authority here. Officer Nachtillo was dismissed for cause, not for any political or improper purpose. Talking about the due process question, again, this is a question of did Officer Nachtillo have an opportunity to respond to the facts as they were presented to him pursuant to the investigation? I submit to you, the answer to that is absolutely yes. He was informed in October of 2021 that the complaints had been filed with the Office of Professional Standards at that time. And then he was given notice of that. He was given notice of all of the investigation reports. He was advised that termination was a consideration for these allegations of performance deficiencies. He was given an opportunity to respond in writing, which he did. So on November 29th, he was informed on November 19th, as early as November 19th. So he has 10 days to know what the facts are that are being considered for policy violations here. Their first meeting is November 29th. He then meets with the chief on December 1st and again on December 3rd. He did have an opportunity, and he did take an opportunity to respond to the facts as they were presented to him. I disagree again with Mr. Wilking's characterization of the meeting. This was not an opportunity to debate what the meaning of lying or intentional may have been. It may have been an interpretation, and it was an interpretation that was within the province of the appointing authority to make. And again, the decision to terminate stands squarely on the shoulders of Chief Zobalski here, and I would submit to you that it was not improper. It was not for improper considerations. It was not politically motivated. It was for cause, and I encourage you to affirm the decision to terminate Officer Nachtillo's employment. Thank you.
You have your employee witness, or we have one witness, Leo, or how many witnesses?
Just one.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, do I have, of the 50 minutes, do I have, 20, 25 at least, possibly? Remaining of my
Yes.
50? Yeah, thank you.
I think we go 50-50. Maybe I can have Ian confirm what we have.
There's 20 minutes left, Mr. Wilkin.
Thank you. So, Officer Nachtillo, let's first address some of what the city attorney has said in her opening remarks. As to the abandoned vehicle, now the city seems to be saying it's not because you destroyed evidence, it's because you engaged in some type of cover-up, like you filed a report that said the case should be marked inactive, and then 30 days later, you indicate that you disposed of evidence. So could you address why you asked that the case be marked inactive, and why there was a delay of 30 days in you indicating that, in fact, some evidence had been accidentally discarded?
Yes, thank you, Commissioners, Mr. Mayor, for allowing me to be here today. So I performed as a detective prior to being involuntarily moved back to patrol upon my return from inpatient treatment. And when we're, as a detective, routinely, we file cases inactive where we submit DNA and we'll reactivate them if we get a result back from the state lab that indicates that there's been a profile match, routinely. So I did that very often as a detective, and that was exactly what I was doing that day. As far as the delay on the report, I was probably 20 reports delayed. I mean, I was really struggling at the time, and that's should be in the investigation. There was over a dozen reports and other things that I was really behind on, and that was a big source of my my struggle. And if you look at the notice that I was given by the chief upon returning from treatment, I mean, I'd never met the chief before. We've never had a conversation one-on-one He doesn't, I don't know anything really about him, and he doesn't know anything about me, other than what has been told to him or is in documentation. So he serves me this, I get told that I'm going back to patrol, and I didn't want that, but I was willing to accept it because I was just happy to be back. And then right on the bottom of that memo, it tells me that anything further will be handled as a performance issue. There was absolutely zero discussion about the department working with me on my issues or any type of a plan to check in on me. There was only one, before the time that I came back to the time that I was told I was the subject of these complaints, there was only one time where a sergeant came up to me in Chick-fil-A when I was eating lunch and asked me how I was doing. And that was the extent of anyone really, checking to see if I was able to perform my duties. I felt like I was just being thrown to the wolves, and I was doing whatever I could to stay above water.
Justin, let me interrupt, because I wasn't really quite clear on what you said about the inactive status. You said that typically, if there is going to be a DNA swab or a DNA analysis, then the case is marked inactive pending the return of that evidence. But in this case, there had been no DNA swab. There was no possibility of a DNA analysis. So I'm a little confused about that.
Yeah, but at the time I typed it, I would have been under the impression I had the can to swipe. Then I realized that I didn't have it. And just to give you an idea of what I would have been doing, I was a CSI at the department for, I think, just a little under 10 years. So I've literally been to homicide scenes and lots of crime scenes, taken photographs, and done lots of DNA analysis. All I intended to do with the soda can, that's all I remember having was the soda can. I wanted to do a swab of the mouth of the soda can. I fully intended to discard the soda can after I had done that and log that swab into evidence. So knowing that, all I needed to do was log a swab into evidence. It takes 5 minutes. And I literally could have, rubbed the thing on the wall and stuck it in evidence, and no one would have known any different.
So you asked that the file be marked inactive before you realized that there was no DNA swab and
Well,
would be no
there was no, I didn't have the can. I thought I had it in my bag, but then I looked later and I didn't have it anymore.
And the 30 days to file the report indicating that you had accidentally discarded some evidence, that delay was consistent with a heavy workload and PTSD issues that the chief refused to recognize. You mentioned this January or early 2020 or early 2021, you came back from the treatment.
Early 2021, I believe.
Okay. And the chief says, you mentioned that everything from now on will be considered performance-based. Did the PTSD go away?
No, it did not.
Okay. So you're still struggling with that, but everything is based on performance. And so when you were struggling to complete reports in a timely manner, I think you described to one of the media outlets you felt you were drowning. Why didn't you go to supervisors and seek help?
Because I thought that I'd probably end up in something like this, and that a complaint would be made against me. I didn't feel comfortable expressing that whatsoever.
Officer Nocitello, to me, it strikes me as somewhat ironic. I'm looking for the shield of the Fargo Police Department, and it has certain words around the Fargo Police Gateway to the West: respect, guardianship, professional, fair. One of the terms is officer wellness, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Has the Fargo Police Department demonstrated an awareness or concern about officer wellness, in your opinion?
Not in my time there, no. No.
So then, on the missing juveniles, although the city has basically conceded that there's nothing you did in that case that would justify termination by agreeing that would withdraw those counts. When you arrived at the school where the West Fargo police officer was located with the parents, he had already talked to them about this custody issue, whether the natural mother had the right to visit the children. He had already conducted some investigation on his own, correct?
Yes, yeah.
And had he concluded initially that these children had not been kidnapped, they were probably with their mother?
Yes, he has more time on than me even, he's more experienced. And we both sat there and interviewed the parents together, and we were reviewing some court documents that were provided to us that they suggested were a custody decree allowing or giving the father sole custody.
So in your discretion, and again, you're a 19-year veteran, you've handled missing persons, missing juvenile cases before, correct?
Yes.
Do you have the discretion to decide whether in fact this child has been abducted or kidnapped or is in danger, or more likely than not, is with one of its biological parents? Do you have the discretion to make that decision and delay filing a missing children's report?
Well, I mean, my belief was that at the time, and as well as the West Fargo officer, was it was a criminal investigation that the mother was in violation of this custody decree. That was both of our intuition at the time. But that being said, I still called a sergeant and I talked to my shift lieutenant just to check and make sure that I was tracking correctly. And following that conversation on the phone, I did exactly what I was told to do. And nowhere in that conversation was I ever instructed to complete these forms that are being referenced. And I was told to go to the residence where the children resided and conduct a canvass. I met there with the parents. And again, much has been made of this 6-hour time frame. They don't talk about what I was doing for that 6 hours, which was sitting with the mother at a table, talking about her family. I did not leave the mother's side until the children were located.
Was it the mother or the stepmother?
The stepmother, I apologize.
And so the parents who were at the school, when you arrived and the West Fargo police officer had been talking to them, it was the stepmother and the father. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay. And during that 6 hours, again, Ms. Morris has made it seem like the stepmother was hysterical, agonizing. Did the stepmother also share your belief that, in all likelihood, the natural mother had taken the children?
Yes, because all of the circumstantial evidence was pointing that way.
So she was concerned about the whereabouts of the children, but she essentially shared your belief that once we hear from the mother, we'll know that she has the children.
Yes, I mean, she was mainly angry that this biological mother just swooped in while she was transporting her husband to work and grabbed the children. So she was more upset with her for that.
Okay. Ms. Morris says that prior to the pre-termination meeting on November 29, you had access to the investigation file, Lieutenant Aberley's reports, and so forth. In any of that material, did you see policy violations that were alleged against you?
I did.
Okay. But did you see any recommended discipline associated with those policy violations?
Well, I know for a fact what I didn't see was any suggestion or indication that I was being accused of false information.
Okay. And ultimately, on December 1, for the first time, you learned that 3 of the 5 violations alleged that you had misrepresented facts and lied during the investigation.
Correct.
And that's not true, is it?
No, it's not.
And so, in terms of how you handled the evidence, and I was going to say, and I think you probably explained it, but you asked the chief, is it your belief I intentionally disposed of those items of evidence? And his response was, this is not the place to debate what has happened. Is that right?
That sounds right, yeah.
And then he said, it's not even a relevant question whether you intended to or not, right?
Yes.
But he was referring to a policy violation supporting termination, which said that you had concealed, attempted to conceal, removed or destroyed evidence, right?
Correct.
So to you, it was a relevant question, very relevant.
Yes.
But the chief didn't want to listen to you, did he?
No.
Didn't, and you were accompanied to that session with Mark Fries, another attorney in Fargo, and Mr. Fries wanted to talk about consistency of discipline, do these offenses justify termination? And the chief's response was, we don't do discipline based on comparison. Is that your recollection?
That sounds about right, yes.
So other officers might have done similar things, but we don't take that into consideration. We don't have to be consistent in discipline. We don't have to compare Officer Nocitello to other people. We can just decide what we want without regard to precedent, what we've done in the past. Does that make sense to you?
Not really.
So you've pursued this through the Civil Service Commission. You've pursued this now to the City Commission. You've offered to resign. Is there a possibility that you would seek another job in law enforcement, maybe not with the City of Fargo, but elsewhere?
It's possible, but there's no plans in my immediate future for that.
But in your mind, the issue of credibility and whether or not you deliberately misrepresented evidence, destroyed evidence, are those important to you in whatever career path you later follow?
Absolutely. It's important to me regardless of what profession I'm in. And that's precisely why I typed up the report saying that I lost the soda can. I knew when I sent that thing off, I knew that a supervisor's eyes were going to see that report. That's how it works. I typed up the report, submitted it. I knew it would be checked by a supervisor, and likely I would be disciplined for it because of what I had been told. But I could not, in good conscience, lie about it. So I did it, submitted it, and here I am.
So in fact, if you hadn't admitted to accidentally discarding the evidence, no one would have known. I mean, the officer, the deputy sheriff, wouldn't have known, wouldn't have cared. No one would have pursued it.
Likely not, no.
So in fact, you could have covered it up, but you didn't.
Correct.
But the chief wasn't interested in hearing that on December 1, was he?
No.
I think that's all we have. My client does have the opportunity for a closing statement, and he will take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you. If I could ask Lieutenant Aberle to step to the podium, please. I'll say good morning, Lieutenant Aberle. It's 1 minute, still morning. What is your role with the police department, and how long have you been a member of the Fargo Police Department?
I am in charge of the Professional Accountability Unit, which is what people would commonly refer to as Internal Affairs, formerly the Office of Professional Standards. I've worked for the Fargo Police Department for just over 20 years.
Okay. What is the process when a complaint is brought against an officer? And then can you explain how these complaints were brought to your attention, please?
So when I myself or the other sergeant that works in my office are notified of a complaint, we will typically begin an investigation into the complaint preliminarily at first to substantiate if there's anything for us to continue. Both of these complaints were generated by different supervisors of Mr. Nocitello. So therefore, because of that, we started doing a preliminary investigation, speaking with them, realizing that there certainly is justification for this complaint. And then at that time, a full-blown formal investigation is conducted into the complaints.
And it is your responsibility to complete a full and fair investigation, is that correct?
Correct. Whether I don't decide discipline, I don't make any of those recommendations. I am there to seek information, and I submit evidence, whether it's, for lack of a better word, incriminating or exculpatory. I submit everything for the chief and the executive staff to review.
And do you feel that you did that in this matter to the best of your ability?
Yes, I do. It's probably one of, if not the most extensive internal investigation that I have ever done.
Did you then notify Officer Nachtillo that the complaints had been initiated?
Yes, when they are notified, they're notified typically via electronic mail that has an attached memo that roughly explains some of the allegations at the time, or the allegations that we are aware of at the time. It sets a time and date for an interview, and also they are required to respond so that I am aware, or I know that they received that message.
Okay. So let's talk first about the complaint regarding the missing children. What is the reporting requirement for a high-risk missing children case?
So the reporting requirement is covered under policy and also under North Dakota Century Code. Anyone missing under 14 or younger, by default, by definition within Century Code, is considered a high risk. If you look in the Century Code, when someone is deemed high risk, again, by the state's definition, there are more steps that need to be taken. You need to immediately enter them into NCIC and national databases. That's where the missing person forms come in that were never completed. That's how you get that information into the NCIC. That's how that information is used, so we can give out a local description and all of that information to local agencies and that type. That is one of 2 or 3 policies that absolutely mirror state law, and you can open that policy and it tells you from beginning to end basically what you need to do, what your time limits are, what forms you need to do.
Thank you. Do you believe that Officer Nachtillo knew or should have known about this requirement?
Yes, I believe that for 2 reasons. Number one, it's incumbent upon every employee to obviously be aware of all of our policies. Now, does that mean we have them memorized verbatim? Absolutely not. But this is a significant one. The second reason that I believe that is in the interview with him, I asked him if he had taken missing person reports before and if he had taken high-risk missing person reports before, and he stated yes to both.
Okay, so regarding Officer Nachtillo's testimony here today, he did go to the school, but then what happened after that?
He went back to the address with the father and soon-to-be stepmother. At that point, after speaking with them, he cleared the call at approximately 10:40 that morning. He then responded to a burglary that had been called in, again, having not filled out the forms, not done any of that. And then 26 minutes after clearing the call, he calls his supervisor's desk phone. The supervisor does not answer the desk phone. I asked him why he made that call. He said, well, that was to get clarification to make sure that he was doing things right. However, he had already left to go take the burglary. Then he begins the burglary, and 23 minutes after that, he then calls his supervisor's cell phone. So 49 minutes after he left and cleared that call, he finally speaks to his supervisor. So as he said in his interview, I called my leadership. I called my supervisor asking what to do, and I believe his word was immediately, and I called from the parking lot. 49 minutes is not an immediate phone call to your supervisor. And a burglary does not take priority over a missing 8 and 12-year-old.
Okay, so in this instance, he did not follow policy, and it was not certain that those children were with the biological mother. Is that correct?
Correct. I asked him a question very similar to that in the interview that said, he said, well, I believed this. And I said, did you have any other evidence to support or not support that they were with the mom? And he said, no, but he believed that it was. I don't think belief and probable and circumstantial are things we can use as why we didn't do what we were supposed to do for an 8 and a 12-year-old.
Okay. So did your investigation then disclose several policy violations with respect to this complaint that had been brought by Officer Nachitilo's supervisors?
Yes.
Okay. And had those supervisors been his supervisors for a period of time?
Yes, I believe they had been since Officer Nachitilo had been on day shift, but I can't tell you exactly how long they would have been his supervisor, but it was for a fair amount of time. It wasn't like it was their first week working together or something.
Okay, thank you. And again, it's not your role to make disciplinary recommendations, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So let's talk about complaint 2146, the stolen vehicle complaint. Did Officer Nachitilo investigate and make the report of that stolen vehicle in accordance with policy?
No, he did not. He didn't do any investigation preliminarily on that. As you stated in your opening arguments, he called the victim and told the victim, well, I'm guessing that it got towed because of what you've told me, so you need to go follow up on that. And then if it turns out it was stolen, give me a call back, and then I'll take the report or whatever his plan was.
So again, Officer Nachitilo appears to be acting on his belief and assumptions rather than the facts and circumstances?
Correct.
Okay. So tell us about how that complaint came to being. Why was a complaint brought in this manner?
So the complaint, excuse me, was discovered, the information was discovered through the report being sent to investigations for follow-up. Another detective was looking at the information and then went through and approached their sergeant and said, hey, I have some issues here. In the report, it says that it was reported missing or reported stolen on the 10th. However, he didn't do the report until at least the 12th, because that's when it was recovered, and that's of July. Then sometime later, this detective then again says he claims that he took evidence and that he was going to do a DNA swab on it. However, that evidence is not here. And in the evidence, he said he was going to take the swab, but then asked for the case to be filed inactive, which according to the investigation sergeant at the time, that is not proper procedure. And then they found out that over 30 days actually, because it was July 12th and August 18th is when he did the supplement stating that he had inadvertently disposed of the evidence. This is what led to that complaint.
Thank you. So Officer Nachitilo testified that it was within his discretion and it was common practice to indicate that a swab would be taken and then close or file the complaint inactive. Is that correct?
Yes, that is what he said. To my knowledge, that is not correct. I have never worked as a property detective, but in speaking with their sergeant at the time, he stated anyone that does evidence should know that that will not be inactive while we have pending evidence.
And so the sergeant explained that to you, that that was not the proper practice regarding the closing of the complaint.
Correct.
Can you tell us what the evidence might have shown and why this was a significant event regarding multiple thefts in the area?
It was later linked, and he would not have known this, but it was later linked to approximately 26 other thefts within the area. And we've been able to get that DNA, which is how the detective was able to get it because they did run the trace. Again, I can't speak for whether that would have sped up any justice being sought or any thing for victims, but it certainly did not help the investigation by that information being withheld.
So by the filing of inactive, did you deduce, request to have it filed inactive, did you deduce that there may have been a policy violation there with respect to the disclosure of the circumstances of the evidence having been lost?
Yes, it's based on what I saw. I agree with what Mr. Nachitilo said, and he did request the evidence. There's no disputing that. However, he inadvertently throws it away, disposes it. I have no way to verify if that's true or not. I'll believe that that is true. However, it shows that, okay, he had the evidence. He claims he's going to take a swab and then disposes of it. He tells me he knew he had lost it either the 12th or the 13th. So the 12th is the day he did the report, 13th being the day after. At no point does he go to his supervisor and say, I'm sorry, I took this can and I accidentally threw it away as I was cleaning out my squad car. I will do a supplemental report stating why this evidence will not be here that I just said I was going to do a swab on. I asked him, why wouldn't you let your supervisor know that? His words, and I can't give you exact quote, was something to the fact of, well, what were they going to do about it? What were they going to do to fix it? So I posed this question. I said, so if you didn't show up for court today, would you wait 30 days to tell your supervisor, or would you tell them immediately that you had made a mistake? He said, well, I would tell them immediately. So that tells me that he covered that up, because he makes it sound as though as soon as he does this report that the supervisor instantly gets it and looks at it. That's not the case. The supervisor has to go through, open it up. He still never came forward and said that I lost this to a supervisor. He documented in a supplemental report trying to file a case inactive so nobody would see it.
Thank you. Did you then, you indicated you've talked to Officer Nachtillo. Did you interview him as to both of the complaints that were made against him?
Yes, he was interviewed twice, 2 different times for each complaint, so for a total of 4.
Okay. And this is prior to his first meeting with Chief Zabalski, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then you provided a detailed summary of the complaints to the executive staff as well?
Yes, I did.
Do you recall when that was?
I believe it was sometime in November. I can't tell you the exact day, unfortunately.
Okay. If the executive staff recommendation for termination is dated November 30th, I believe, does that square with your recollection?
That it does, but again, I can't be for sure.
Okay. I don't know if you have the exhibits in front of you. I've got exhibit number 18 to the documents that are presented to the Civil Service and now to City Commission is a memo from Captain Vinson to Chief Zabalski, executive staff recommendation. At that time, you indicated that you provided a detailed summary of the complaints to executive staff. Again, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and did you also present policy violations that may have been found through your investigation?
Yes, the summary basically explains the information that I obtained through interviews, other evidence, using the automatic vehicle locator, radio traffic, his phone records, all of the different things that I used to, or information that I obtained for the investigation.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask this question. Executive staff would at that time be Captain George Vinson, Assistant Chief Travis Stefanovitz, and was it, who else was involved in that decision-making?
It would also be Deputy Chief Joe Anderson and Captain Chris Helmick. Those 4 make up the executive staff.
Okay. And so they had the opportunity to also consider all of the evidence that you had compiled and is included in the documents submitted to Civil Service and City Commission. They didn't have the documents at the time, but they had the opportunity for all of the investigative information independently. Is that correct?
Correct. I gave them a summary, but all 4 of them are also granted the same access to those investigative files that I am. Therefore, they can see every single document and piece of information.
And it is your understanding, and you recall that the executive staff recommended termination as a result of all of the facts that were submitted to them for consideration of employment action?
That is my understanding based off of the memo. After I present that information, again, I am not part of the discipline decision. So typically I leave as long as no one has any questions, then typically I will leave after that. But based off of the memo and everything, it is my understanding that it was a unanimous decision for termination.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, see, Ian, are we kind of going over our time? As I recall, we were supposed to be 50 minutes into this.
It's 50 minutes. It's 50 minutes per. per side mare. So Mr. Wilkins got 45 minutes. Nancy's at 18, about 31.
Okay, just want to remind each side. Thank you.
Thank you. Lieutenant Aberly, you have been listening to Officer Nachtillo and statements today. Is there anything stated in your evidentiary findings that would conflict with Officer Nachtillo's statements today, to your recollection? You stand by your evidentiary findings?
I do. There were a couple things I think that are worth mentioning, one of which there was discussion that termination was never discussed or was never part of it. I disagree. On the 19th of November, when I served him the memo and gave him the flash drive of all of his documents, he stated, and this is probably a quote, but I'm not 100% sure, but he asks me, "So I don't work here anymore?" And I said, "No, that's not the case. You have the right to a predetermination hearing, which is what we have scheduled. You have the right to give us information. Here is all of the information I have, except for what was on the automatic vehicle locator." And I told him if he wanted to see that information, he needed to contact me because there's licensing issues. We can't send that up. He stated that he understood that. So he knew that termination was on the table. Another thing, when he talks about the prior complaint, where the allegation is that Chief Zabolski said from here on out, everything will be performance-based. That part is true. What they left out is prior to that, the chief outlines and says, you have been given the tools and it is your responsibility to make sure you comply with your treatment or whatever that plan is in order for you to be successful. So from here on out, your performance will be based upon that. So some of that was missing. The last thing that I want, Justin Nachtillo made the comment that he never left the stepmother or soon-to-be stepmother's side. That's not true. Obviously, he left at one point to go take a burglary, which he called out on the radio for, part of the dispatch events, and I have the automatic vehicle locator and the time that shows he did do that.
And so you provided that evidence to him, and he did have an opportunity to request additional investigation with respect to the evidence you presented, correct?
Yes, he did.
And you did, in fact, engage in that additional information and supplemented your report?
Yes, I did. Based upon his requests, I did conduct additional investigation.
And that additional investigation and report was provided to Chief Zabolski before making his employment decision. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions for you, Lieutenant Everly. Thank you. I would like to pose a few questions to Chief Zabolski as the appointing authority, commissioners. So first off, I'm going to ask, Chief, everything you've heard today, after everything from the Civil Service Commission hearing, your opportunity to review all of the evidence, is it still your decision to terminate Officer Nachtillo's employment as a police officer with the City of Fargo?
Yes.
Thank you. When did you commence your position with the City of Fargo?
October 5th of 2020.
Was there a complaint pending regarding Officer Nachtillo at that time for failing to satisfy a performance improvement plan initiated by Sergeant Erickson?
Yes, there was.
Did you meet with Officer Nachtillo and others pending that complaint and determine path forward as far as fitness for duty?
Yes, I did.
And did you direct Officer Nachtillo to undergo a fitness for duty evaluation?
Yes, I did, and I also offered him other opportunities should he decide that being a police officer was no longer something he wanted to do, but would allow us to retain him as an employee in some other position with the city.
Okay. But at some point, Officer Nachtillo was found not to be fit for duty, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then you did place him on unpaid leave and give him an opportunity to be returned to duty in a full capacity, is that correct?
Yes.
And he did, in fact, return to duty, full capacity, return for full service.
Yes.
Okay. Had there been discussions about, you just indicated that there had been, but there was still an opportunity for him to seek additional wellness or treatment if necessary at any time, is that correct?
That's correct. And in my conversations with the treatment party, they noted that he was provided all of the tools necessary to perform at full duty and meet all of his obligations as a law enforcement officer.
Okay, thank you. Were you made aware of the complaints against Officer Nachtillo by Officer Nachtillo's supervisor, Sergeant Mark Licken, and Sergeant Halverson? In
Yes,
September of 2021?
yes,
And it's your understanding those complaints were formalized and directed to the Professional Accountability Unit for investigation?
yes,
And at that point, the investigation is ongoing, you do not have any direct role in that investigation?
correct.
Okay. I'd like to talk to you about the stolen vehicle report. Was his performance unsatisfactory in that?
Yes,
Why is that?
entirely from start to finish. A stolen vehicle is something that we would respond to in person to verify ownership, enter that vehicle into the National Crime Information Center so that as a reported stolen vehicle, an officer doesn't inadvertently stop that car and get hurt or killed because the occupants are involved in other crimes, including the theft of the auto. There's evidence at the scene of a stolen auto, broken glass, there's other things, there's canvassing, there's things that could be done. We certainly don't turn it over to the victim and ask them to investigate and call us back later. From there, the vehicle was recovered by another agency 2 days later, and still no report is entered into the system. The only reason that sheriff's deputy could connect this to Mr. Nachtillo was going through our RMS system and seeing that he had been sent 2 days earlier, but there was no report. And at that point, the deputy met with him and provided him evidence, which he failed to safeguard, which he failed by his own admission in the reports to even look at to see what he had. As he said, he wasn't sure that there were socks in there, but he was told there was a can. And ultimately, that evidence was lost, destroyed, it's gone. He intentionally failed to report that immediately, and then filed a report, as Lieutenant Averly says, indicating that he's going to process evidence that you could decide one way or the other whether or not intentional or accidentally he didn't have the evidence, and then indicated that the report should be inactive. That report goes through the system, gets typed, and goes to a supervisor. As the lieutenant says, there's a time lapse before that's even seen, but he would know that that report, once read, would be nothing more would happen and nothing more would come of it. It wasn't until 30 days later, for whatever reason, he decided to now, in another report his omission. And of course, it was connected to 26 other cases.
So do you feel that it was an attempt to manipulate the evidence destruction by the request to file it inactive in both instances?
I think, well, certainly it was an attempt to cover up incompetent work, and yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about 2147. I think we just have a few minutes left. Was his performance unsatisfactory with respect to the missing children complaint?
Unconscionably so.
And why is that?
Well, from the very beginning, this dispatch call about two critical missing kids, 10 and 12, indicating that they were gone from the apartment, their phones were inside, parents had no idea where they were, is a very concerning call for service. That is a priority one call for service. He took 27 minutes to get there, during which time he was actually at the station when he got the call, and this is in the reports as well. He'd been on duty for nearly 3 hours, but still took 4 minutes to even leave the station, where he could have gotten the missing persons report he should have well known he needed, but he didn't. Then he decided to go and stop for a coffee and then ultimately get over to this call a total of 27 minutes later. Once on scene, as he's indicated here today, he deduced improperly, or fortunately, but also incorrectly, that there was really nothing more for him to do, and decided in the midst of this to actually violate state law and policy by not entering the missings into the NCIC system, which is required by law and policy. And then went on, took another call of much less importance, And then ultimately, the kids were found in another state 6 hours later, so that was fortunate. But complete ineptness and a lack of urgency in his investigation.
Did you find any of Officer Nachatilo's explanations or reasons for his conduct and performance deficiencies to be persuasive?
No.
Okay, and there were numerous policy violations that you had determined existed?
Yes.
And did Officer Nachatilo's conduct violate the police department mission and vision and purpose statements?
Yes, it did. And it's interesting. It's happy to be talking about our values. So let's talk about guardianship. Certainly, there was no sense of urgency in the response to these missing kids, no commitment to ensure their safety. Everything was good as long as, in his own mind, it was a hunch that they were with someone, he just said again today, who shouldn't have had them, the biological mother. He failed to protect those kids. He failed to properly investigate the stolen vehicle that was connected to 26 other cases, not showing guardianship toward our community or, in the other case, the children. From a professional standpoint, he failed to properly safeguard, collect, and process evidence. His response to calls in both instances were not within our standards of professional conduct and expectation. He failed to follow law and policy in both instances. In terms of accountability, he blames everyone else and takes little to no accountability for himself. And I think interestingly enough, Officer Wellness, I sat down and had a very lengthy conversation with him, a very heartfelt conversation, because I do appreciate his service both in the military and the department, but that does not excuse incompetent conduct or work performance, and talked with him extensively about all of his potential options back in November before we sent him for his fitness for duty, because I wanted to give him every possible option to find some other employment opportunity if this wasn't going to be for him because of whatever potential inability he had to perform to department standards. So I think in terms of all of the values, our mission and providing outstanding service to our community and our policy violations, he was outside of all of those. None of this was improperly or politically motivated. The ends do not justify the means. The fact that we are lucky the kids were okay, we're lucky his 27-minute response didn't create additional harm to them, we're lucky a cop didn't unknowingly stop a stolen car and get hurt or killed because he failed to investigate and report it, and we're lucky that the prosecution of 26 other felony stolen auto crimes doesn't rely on the fact that he lost significant evidence in his investigation. So luck is not a measure of success, nor is it a measure of performance.
Thank you. You met with Officer Nachatilo. I'm going to go to the due process question just briefly. On at least 3 occasions, is that correct?
Yes.
And he did have an opportunity to review the evidence and provide a written statement regarding all of the evidence that was presented for your consideration. Is that correct?
Yes, he did. And both in November, in terms of the discussion or the testimony I just offered, but also on November 19th, he was given an additional 5 days. By policy, we only have to give 5 days. We intentionally provided a long period of time for him to review documents to provide him additional due process. When he showed up on the 29th, he indicated his attorney was unavailable, and so that's why we rescheduled for the 1st. He did provide a letter in response and responded with a couple-page letter to the allegations and whatever mitigating factors he thought were involved, which is appropriate and pursuant to policy and law. And we did that additional investigation, again, trying to afford him every opportunity for due process. When we met on the 1st, the charges were gone over with him again, and he had every opportunity to respond to those. And then again on the 3rd, and again, there was additional 48 hours from the 1st to the 3rd for any additional response. So I'll forego the video, but I'll accept to say that I would not agree with the opposing attorney in terms of his how the statements and the responses went. That is not correct. And go from there.
Thank you. So again, I will ask, is there any doubt in your mind that termination was not the proper discipline for the sustained policy violations?
No, I do not. And, again, this is not a decision that's taken lightly. No one enjoys disciplining, much less terminating an employee, especially someone who has been with the department as long as he has. But as we've outlined here today, he's been given every opportunity to properly perform and meet the expectations of the department and the community. And he failed to do that. And so, although he's got 19 years of service, that is not an excuse to overlook these egregious violations.
Thank you. I have no further questions or testimony.
Commissioners, do you have any questions?
Mr. Chair, I have a question for Justin. Can you talk a little bit about the mental health support that you get from the city? And maybe Jill can talk a little bit about it too, but just over you've been there 19 years, what goes on, and do you feel it was adequate? Thank you.
Well, the majority of the assistance that I've sought and been provided was through the VA. But to my understanding, we've been told that we have the village, basically, that we can schedule counseling there. However, they don't really have staff there that are specialized in treatment of, veteran trauma, things like that.
So, Mr. Chair, if I can continue. So at the police department, did you have specific people that you felt you could talk to or that they offered to you? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
They have a peer support team that we can talk about issues with, and there was an officer that I'm personal friends with that I would talk to occasionally. But they're not, they don't conduct any treatment or anything like that.
I guess my main question is, the statement you made was you felt like you were drowning, or it was hard to keep up. To me, I'm concerned when I hear that. I want to make sure our officers are getting the correct amount of mental health support. And to me, I don't know if this raises anybody else's concern, but are we doing that? Maybe Jill, you can talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioners. So we do have an employee assistance program that's been in place for years for all City of Fargo employees. When there are services that exceed their practice, they are able to refer to other specialists within the community as well as needed. Within the police department, and members of the department are better able to speak to this, but there is a peer support group within the department as well. And over the last couple of years, I know that several measures have been taken to understand what the needs are of the department in terms of overall wellness, so all forms of wellness, including mental health. And recent approaches have been rolled out, and we're continuing to review with members of the department what those desired options are for mental health and overall wellness services as well.
Can I just add one more? So to me, peer support, that's nice, but we need to have professional people helping our officers. That's my opinion. I think this is serious. And to me, what you said was the VA was supportive. I guess this is I'm asking your opinion. Do you wish we had more support for you in the actual police department?
I do, yes. Oh, excuse me. I do. Being a first responder, there's some similarities to military service, but it does have its own unique set of elements. And I think, a few of the different treatments I've underwent with the VA, I think it would be beneficial if they were available. Counseling is good, don't get me wrong, but there's specialized treatments I've done specifically for PTSD and treatments also for chronic depression, things like that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Jill, just for the record, you go into this particular issue because he actually was recommended to go see somebody and was not allowed to come back to work until he was fit for duty by that professional. Is that not correct?
Right. So I believe that he saw the department's psychologist and was placed on leave of absence and allowed a time during FMLA to seek services. And then upon return, and actually prior to return, we always work with individuals too to determine if there are any accommodations that will support and allow them to perform the essential functions of the position and to perform in a way that's meeting expectations of the position as well. So we did go through those processes in this case with Justin as well to allow leave of absence as needed and to work through an interactive process to determine if, in fact, there were accommodations that would support him.
And Chief Zabowski, he was not allowed to come back to work until his professional said he could?
Correct. And just for the record, he, working through the city psychologist, was specifically sent to a treatment program dealing with a veteran-type psychologist, so military-type issues, and that was specific to the plan so that he would be able to be successful.
Thank you. Commissioner Preston?
Yeah, this is a question for the chief. You had talked about a counseling session of sorts in regards to whether there was another position that might be available that would be perhaps a better fit. What was the date around that? Or close to a date?
I have it right here. That was November 2nd of 2020.
Okay.
Did you want me to elaborate any further, or no?
Nope, that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Strand?
Thank you, Mayor.
Oh, Exhibit 26. I'm
you
sorry,
all-
Exhibit 26, that was just a clarification.
I'm sorry.
That's on Exhibit 26, that particular memo.
That is in the materials provided.
There's a lot of materials here. Thank you. Found it.
Commissioner Strand?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure if this is a question for Jill or for the chief, but from the balcony view, what's our experience in our history with military service? And how is it treated? How do we receive it? How do we honor it or not? How does it impact our relationship with folks when they come back from the service, especially to war-torn parts of the world?
So I can address that just briefly citywide, and maybe the chief wants to respond as well. But we meet with individuals prior to their leave and upon return. Again, making sure that they're aware of all of the benefits available and supporting in any way that we can during that time. And then certainly, we expect at the department level as well that there is interaction with that person returning from a leave of absence. And we have active military, several throughout the city, and veterans. And so that is important that we are having those communications before and after a leave of absence. But those leadership teams within the department and peers within the departments are interacting most frequently. So I will let the chief address departmental interactions.
Thank you. And very much the same, and recognizing that they have specific needs for psychological services, just as we did in this plan. Part of that discussion with the city psychologist is to make sure that we identify a treatment plan, and in this incident, Mr. Natatillo was out for a significant period of time. If I remember correctly, it was at least a couple of months or more to specifically allow him to get into this specific program that is for veterans dealing with the issues that he was dealing with, to ensure that he would then have the tools to function, and then following that, there's a fitness for duty in which he's found to be fully fit and was provided with any tools necessary to ensure that he retains that fitness.
If I might continue, this topic of PTSD, and you've mentioned it today, and depression as mental, behavioral, medical health issues. This topic of PTSD is an evolving one, where I'm guessing we're all learning a lot more through time. It isn't just cut and dry where we knew the answers before. In the context, and we've had a couple of these instances hit the city, at least one other one that I'm aware of, but if you have emergency responders or people that are ambulance or fire or protection or law enforcement or military, or ACEs, childhood experiences that people carry into their jobs, it's just an evolving course of action. And I'm just curious, in light of what's all unfolded in this moment and with other circumstances, where are we going forward that will be for everybody's benefit? What are we learning about how to best handle these moments in the future?
I believe at Monday's commission meeting, you will be getting some information and a video about what the department's done in terms of moving forward with our employee wellness program, and specifically dealing with the mental health issues. And you're correct, this has been a long-term issue. One of the things that we have done going forward is also partner with psychologists who are connected to the ICP, police-type psychologist groups, that we'll be utilizing going forward for all of those types of services, from hiring to evaluation, et cetera. But again, at the end of the day, as you said, this is a complicated issue, and it also can be a very sad issue because, again, we do honor our veterans. We appreciate their service. And where it gets difficult is that as a chief, as a city commissioner, we have a responsibility to ensure that people we're putting out there to protect the public are capable of doing that, and that they are doing that. And which is exactly why back in November I had this conversation, because I understand the issue and I want to provide anyone an opportunity to retain employment if they are unable to perform. And so I think from that perspective, and I know HR has done some things as well, I think we did everything we could in this case to offer those options, but we can't make someone take it.
Last question, Mayor. How exactly were these 3 policy violations taken off the table and out of the 5? And in retrospect, with 3 out of 5 eliminated, would that have changed the course of action up front?
I can address that as part of the settlement discussions. Mr. Wilking raised the due process question. Again, we indicated that we don't necessarily agree. I would argue that, in fact, due process was accomplished at all steps of the proceedings. But if the argument was that 3 of them were not afforded due process, then it was an agreement among the city staff and addressing what would be the proper response to that. If that was, in fact, something that he wished to appeal going forward, that, okay, we'll take those 3 off the table, but the termination for the other 2 counts continues, and makes sense that the termination was the appropriate action for the sustained policy violations.
Commissioner Preston.
Can somebody point me to the exhibit? What I'm looking at here are 6 policy violations, and everybody keeps referring to 5. Can you point me to the exhibit that shows the 5? I'm looking at exhibit, I think it's S, has 6 policy violations.
I think Ms. Morris would agree that the city's exhibits 20 and 22 outline the various policy violations for both 046 and 047. And there are 3 policy violations for the abandoned vehicle, which would result in termination, 2 efficiency, 1 performance. And there are 2 policy violations for the missing juveniles that would result in termination, both performance. So I think there are only 5. And Ms. Morris, as she's just explained, agreed to take 3 of the 5 off the table, but not the other 2. And if I may, in response to Commissioner Strand's question, would things have perhaps turned out differently? I think it's very significant that during the December 1 pre-termination meeting, Chief Zabolski says, untruthfulness is a terminable offense. Clearly, that was his primary consideration, untruthfulness. And now the city of Fargo has agreed they can't prove untruthfulness, or at least they can't prove that due process was given to my client regarding untruthfulness. So what are they left with? Lack of efficiency That's all they have. And I don't think discarding of a pop can, you know, again, it's just inconceivable to me that you would fire a 19-year veteran for accidentally discarding a pop can and not allow him to resign. Thank you.
Commissioners, if I could respond to that. I do concur that the policy violations that were discussed during our earlier communications are identified on Exhibits 20 and 22. Mr. Wilking's letter, his first letter requested that the policy violation number 6, policy 320, which was sustained, and the discipline termination on item 20 be withdrawn, and the policy 320 for 5 and 6 on Exhibit 22 be withdrawn. Again, I would disagree that the untruthfulness could not be proven and has not been. I believe that it has been. The question of the due process was for settlement purposes, and in any event, the termination would still stand because there were at least 2 counts that Chief Zabowski recommended termination. I would also assert that the executive staff did not make a separate determination as to each policy violation. This was actually something Chief Zabowski did separate. It's not been done in the past. If any of the policy violations would result in termination, termination is the recommended course of action. Thank you.
Any other questions of the commissioners? Commissioner Strand?
Thank you. Chief, I'm just curious if had the officer involved offered his resignation way back when, at the beginning of this, how would you have accepted it?
Well, yeah, I mean, if there was a resignation, certainly. I think the issue is that, and as I kind of outlined earlier, that there was a significant amount of time, an opportunity to provided for him and with legal counsel to make a decision like that. And once we proceeded through to termination, and I think HR might have, and Nancy, some comments on that as well. I think you're past that point.
I would agree with that, you know, whether it's the police department's predetermination hearings or in other departments where we're having those discussions, presenting the facts and the information that we have that has been utilized to make that employment decision, that predetermination period is the opportunity if an employee would choose to resign at that point voluntarily. Once a termination has occurred, we really have passed that opportunity for voluntary resignation.
Nancy?
I would concur with that. Once the termination has occurred by the appointing authority, the employee has the opportunity to appeal that termination to the Civil Service and City Commission. And I would submit that the review of that appointing authority's decision, like I've indicated earlier, rests squarely with that appointing authority. If you find that it was an improper consideration, politically motivated, then you're certainly within your province to either accept the resignation with that finding that the termination was not proper, but otherwise I encourage you to recognize the authority of the appointing authority here in making this decision.
Commissioner Preston?
Nope.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you had a hand up. Commissioner Strand?
My last question, I think, is, of course, we have, if you're running a police department, or you're running an HR department, or running a city, or, you know, you really have to have rules. And you have to have predictable behaviors, of course. I understand all that, but here's what I'm wondering is, at what point, and or at when is it appropriate to add heart to that? And I'm not saying we're heartless, but at what point can we find a balance between those rules and having a heart? allowing somebody with all support available from everybody to go reinvent your life, go get started over again, go get yourself back on track or not. I'm just trying to balance this notion. People might look at the city and go, you're just hard and fast, rule-oriented, and you don't seem to have a heart in this. And I don't know that we don't or do, but how do we balance that? This is where I'm landing here, is this balance of humanity and rules. And of course you're following the rules. Of course you need people doing the jobs. But how can you answer that really odd question of heart?
Commissioner, completely appreciate your concerns, your compassion for others. We share that same compassion. But as I said earlier, we also have to look at the safety of the community and the safety of other officers, which was egregiously ignored in all of these instances. In appreciation of those concerns, as I said earlier, I had lengthy discussion with Mr. Nachitillo about this, even understanding that at times people who have certain conditions, having been an officer, having been a military person, find it extremely difficult to at the right juncture go, maybe this is no longer for me because of A, B, and C. And I offered that landing pad to him, and I had that whole discussion with him, just as I've had with other officers in other departments over the course of my career. And for whatever reason, he decided not to take that option, and we've continued through this process to the point where I don't know that you can go backwards. And I'm not going to weigh in on that. All I'm going to say is that's where we find ourselves based on what's happened in legal and in HR processes and guidance.
John, I think the city has a heart. I think we have to be a little bit careful about that, but you have to do performance, and performance is difficult at times. And in my professional career with a variety of different doctors, trying to keep them in practice. And sometimes there's some rules we have to follow, and if they can't do the performance, it's just, let's pursue something else. This gentleman was given a month or 2 months of treatment. He came back and was found fit for service and still was unable to perform. It's a difficult position because we like somebody who's worked for us for many years, but yet at the same time, the public expects a certain performance when our police officers are out there. And it's a tough love in some ways. You have to do the things that you're supposed to do by law, and we expect that standard in our police force. So that's where I think Ian will define at the end what we're really supposed to do with this hearing with the 2 suggested motions, but the Civil Service Commission made a decision, and we just, in some ways, are to verify that. But I think, any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I just have a quick comment then. So to me, those are the 2 motions, but we do have a third option, and that's to accept the resignation. That's up to us as a commission. We do have that option. So I don't think that's true that we have to do either one or the other of the 2 motions. I do believe that's up to us. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay. Final statement by the employee, Justin?
Thank you, sir. It's, all this stuff is difficult for me to talk about because, being a police officer has been such a big part of my identity. Service is a big part of my identity. And listening to the chief characterize what happened and the manner that he is, it's, discouraging to say the least. Regarding his comment about why I would not choose to or elect to take another job, well, that occurred, this conversation occurred before I went to treatment, and I'm committed to being a police officer, and I wanted to try every last thing I could in my power to make it work, because that's just what the job needs to be, my commitment to my duty. And so, just to be offered, why didn't I go work for the water department or something? Well, it's because I feel called to be a police officer. That's what my calling has always been. Regarding the treatment that I went to, I was on sick leave and basically consuming my sick time. And the treatment I ultimately went to I was the one that found the treatment. The department did not assist in any way, shape, or form in me finding treatment, because this was right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and the VA was backed up months. They couldn't get me in anywhere. So I had to scramble before I used up all my sick leave and find some place to go. Ended up finding this place called Shatterproof down in Deerfield Beach, Florida, which I would highly recommend in the future if we have anyone that's interested. That's a really good program down there. Anyway, so come back. Yes, I get cleared for duty. You know, I wasn't even my best shot, you know, to see if I can make a go of it and still do the job. And like I said, that the first thing that's given to me is this statement saying that, you know, hey, you should be able to treat this. You've been cleared for duty. If you're not pulling your weight, you know, you're gonna get a complaint. So, and before I went to treatment, had been up in as a detective, and they put me on a performance improvement contract specifically because I was getting behind on reports. That was the whole reason for that performance improvement contract. I was getting behind on reports. And there was, like I said, no follow-up. Once I got on the street, and they put me on patrol, and that's fine. I love patrol. But there was no follow-up as to, you know, was I getting behind on reports, or how are my reports looking, or, you know, how was I doing generally? There was none of that. There's no plan put in place. Like I said, just like maybe just one or two times that my sergeant said, hey, how you doing? And that's it. So I was struggling. I don't deny that. I fully accept, and the suggestion I don't accept responsibility. I accept responsibility, but I'm not going to sit and be accused of something I didn't do and just take it. I'm going to defend myself, and I would defend anyone else too that was falsely accused of something. There was no intent on my part to conceal anything, not to, you know, the suggestion I didn't care about these kids, that's preposterous. You have to put yourself in my position at the time and see it in that context. I was struggling. I was doing, putting, we call it laser feeds. It's like how we upload photographs. I was doing that at the station, get the call. There's nothing about the call that indicates that I should respond without delay. Nothing by the dispatcher. You can listen to the tape yourself. And there's already an officer with the kids. So, I mean, every day we depend on other officers to tell us, you know, how we should respond to a call. And there was no indication, even when you listen to the tape of the West Fargo officer on the line with the dispatcher, he doesn't say, make sure the officer gets here right away, or anything like that. There's nothing panicked about his tenor or anything like that. So, and, you know, what's not mentioned by them is the fact that, you know, they make a big deal about how long it took me to get there. They didn't even interview the West Fargo officer, the parents of the children, until I demanded that they do. And when they did, at my request, the West Fargo officer made no mention of the fact that I took too long to get there. And he fully agreed with me that his belief at the time was that the children were with their biological mother. But that being said, after I left the school, I contacted a sergeant and a lieutenant on the phone, had conversation. No mention was made of the NCIC report. This is a sergeant and a lieutenant. So if I'm being held accountable because I don't have my forms and because I don't know the policy verbatim, and because it was a unique circumstance too, why are the sergeant and the lieutenant not being disciplined? And it should also be noted too, the sergeant who was involved in that situation has since resigned from the department. I can't speak as to why, but he doesn't work there anymore. But no one else in this entire situation, in that entire incident, received any discipline. There was a sergeant that I called on the radio to ask somebody for forms. He later in the day had to go get forms for me. He didn't have them in his possession. He hasn't received any discipline. The sergeant that resigned, I have text correspondence with him. If you go look at his text messages, he was fully satisfied with my performance, and he actually called me, quote unquote, the man. I was the man. He texted that to me. You can look it up. But yet somehow, by the very next day, I'm put in for a complaint on the whole thing. So I do feel like, there was lieutenants or sergeants involved in that incident, all the way up to like the assistant chief. They were having like a confab at the station about it, and I was not kept up to speed on the whole thing. And yet I'm the fall guy. I take the heat for all of it. I'm the incompetent one. Okay. Anyway, regarding that incident also, Lieutenant Aberly brought it up that I went from the school to the address of the kids and then to the burglary call, and that's factually incorrect. And I don't know if we have the GPS data available right now, but I took a photo of it yesterday and sent it to Mr. Wilking. So just indulge me for a second here. Here we go. Yeah, so I think it's September 7th. Lieutenant Aberly documents a timeline of my GPS data, and he has here at 10:40, I was dispatched to the burglary down in South Fargo. But then 7 minutes later, he has me leaving 1717 40th Street South, which is the address that the kids live at. You can't make it. You can't even drive from those two locations in 7 minutes, and much less do anything there in 7 minutes. So that's incorrect. I went directly from the school to the address in South Fargo to take the burglary call, and then I had the phone conversations with the sergeant and lieutenant at that location. They told me to go to 1717 40th Street South, and I did immediately after that call. The chief used this timeline to, one of the charges against me is for lying about leaving the address 1770 40th Street South and going to the burglary. I never lied about it. I told exactly what I did. I went to the burglary, and that can be verified if you look at the GPS data. And it should also be noted that one of the complaints against me also is for, this is in regard to the stolen vehicle. I made a typographical error. I put the address of the victim as the location where the vehicle had been stolen, but actually he lived at a different address. I got 8 days suspension without pay for that typo. This typo cost me termination. Just saying. So when I went to treatment, I spent Christmas away from my family. The chief didn't contact me once during that entire time I was down there. And he talks about this heartfelt conversation there's never been a heartfelt conversation between us. And I mean, he did offer to have me go work somewhere. I'll definitely concede that. But another point regarding the missing juveniles. So the chief references that it's my call and that it's my responsibility. I'm referencing NDCC 12-68 having to do with missing persons. Subsection 1, letter E, states that a report of a missing person may be made by any law enforcement agency in the state. The law enforcement agency may not refuse to accept a missing person report solely on the basis of, and then subsection E is, there is no indication that the missing person was in the jurisdiction served by the law enforcement agency at the time of the disappearance, which means that under the state law, the West Fargo officer is actually the the primary responding officer. Yet I took the case from him, trying to help him out because he works at the school. So I do that, call a sergeant, call a lieutenant, do everything they tell me, and I did sit in contradiction to Lieutenant Gabriel, I did sit with the mother the entire time. We can call her up on the phone right now. I sat with her for the entire time. I did not leave her side until her kids were found. They didn't interview the parents. I had to request that. And when they did interview the parents, they both spoke very highly of me. They said I was, quote, very professional and very concerned. That flies in the face of what the chief is telling you here.
Ian, are we about on time here?
Yeah, I think we're well over the 50-minute time.
Justin, could
limit.
you wrap it up? You're kind of getting
Again,
repetitive now,
yes.
please.
I don't know, you'd have to look. So I guess in summary, all I'm looking for from the commission is just the opportunity to just, knock the dust off my sandals and just walk away from the department and be able to pursue my next career or whatever that might be. But through this whole thing, I mean, what else do you need to tell you that something smells in the state of Denmark here? This whole exercise was not conducted in good faith. There's tons of examples of it. I just hope that the city, if it's possible to have an independent entity look into the situation, I would fully cooperate. If you need me to come in and take a polygraph examination, I'd be willing to do that. I don't think you'll get anybody on that side to volunteer unless it's compulsory. But I would, and there's a situation with like law enforcement and the justice system in general in the country right now where there's a lack of trust and favoritism, things like that, nepotism, professional courtesy. But something that's sacrosanct to law enforcement has to be due process and fundamental fairness. And, there's numerous examples throughout my situation where, I was not dealt with fairly. I mean, I don't know how with a straight face someone can say that this was a thorough investigation when they were fully willing to close the book on me without even talking to half the people involved. There's no way. There's not an investigation I've ever done in my career that I would ever not speak to the principal parties. I mean, that right there, it smells. And, where there's smoke, there's fire. So I hope the city will look into it further. And there's also the perspective that in this country, some people believe that there's a two-tiered justice system. And I think, my situation definitely illustrates that is the current environment at the Fargo PD. Everything that I've been accused of here, there's supervisors that did what I did or worse. And yet, not a single inquiry was open. And I even complained about a supervisor that threatened me days before I went on administrative leave. That was never looked into. I mean, there's no files open on any of these supervisors. They just, they operate by a different standard, different set of rules than a line level officer. I think that's something that has to be addressed. And I do hope the best for the Fargo PD. I mean, I invested a good part of my adult life there. And I love the community. I'm glad I was able to serve the people I did. And I'll always have good memories of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appointing authority, is that Nancy Morris or Chief? Who goes to final?
The chief will address you directly.
Thank you, Commissioners, for your time and attention to this very complicated, involved process. I believe it was a very comprehensive investigation. It was properly conducted, not politically motivated. And I would ask that you affirm the decision to terminate Mr. Nachitillo based on the findings of the recommendations of our executive staff and final decision by myself in that regard. Thank you.
And how do we proceed now?
So now it's time for the city commission to have any sort of conversations that they want to have amongst themselves and to make a motion. The standard here, this is an appeal from the Civil Service Commission. So the question is, was the termination for cause and not motivated by political or other improper considerations? But to Commissioner Pepcorn's point, this commission does have the power, if they would like, to accept his resignation. To do so, you'd want to amend the second proposed motion, and just at the end, instead of reinstating him, you would move to accept his resignation if that's the way the commission wanted to go.
Discussion. Commissioner Strand.
Ian, if the commission were to accept the resignation, would that also require a reversing and a vacating of the civil service action?
I believe the answer to that is yes.
And secondly is, if there were an acceptance of any type of resignation, would that be the end of everything now, potentially, or no?
I believe it would be the end of everything, yes.
Mayor Mahoney, I can assure Commissioner Strand that would be the end of everything.
Thank you. Commissioner Preston.
Can we ask questions of individuals out
We're
there?
actually closed for public hearing now.
Okay, even their employees?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not clear in regards to what impact that has on the HR process. That would be the only question I would have.
I think that is a decision you're trying to make now. It's not going back to the discussion. You could ask Joe that if you'd like. That'd be fine.
Okay. I'm thinking precedents or, what impact would that have?
Yeah, it certainly is concerning in terms of setting precedents for other situations where employees have been terminated or future separations that might occur that would follow the same processes allowed here. I would anticipate you would get many more requests of this nature to retroactively resign after going through, both civil service and potentially commission appeal hearings.
Commissioner Pepcorn.
My main concern is this is the first opportunity for us as a commission to have that opportunity to accept the resignation. So that's the thing. I'm not sure this order was handled correctly because I think if we have, at least I haven't had any knowledge of this until now, of the offer of resignation. And that could have saved a lot of things from my perspective. And so when you're ready for a motion, I'm ready for a motion.
Any other discussion? Is there a motion?
Mr. Chair, I'll make the motion, motion number 2, but changing the wording to what Ian recommended, if you don't mind, just so we get it correctly, and I will make the motion.
Is there a second?
Let's hear the motion first, if you don't mind.
I think the motion that Commissioner Pepcorn would like to make is I move the board to reverse and vacate the February 11, 2022 decision of the Civil Service Commission regarding the termination of police officer Justin Nachitillo, and that the city of Fargo accept his resignation.
Is there a second?
Second.
I would speak against this because actually Civil Service had a long hearing on this particular problem. And the reason we did not take it to the commission at the time it was offered to Nancy is his attorney had also offered new evidence, which you cannot do. If the Civil Service has made its decision, we could see no new evidence. So the proper sequence would be to come to this commission and make our decisions. At this commission, we would make the decision of what to do. And part of the issue with the resignation, then honesty, which is a completely part of a police officer, he has to be honest. He would normally go to the state board and ask that be wiped clean so he can take another job in a police force somewhere else. the difficulty we have, regardless of how you debate the facts, is that if you ever lie as a police officer, it's almost impossible to do that job again, because anytime you're called into court, they will know that you lied. So it makes it extremely difficult to do that. Now, you can be a security officer in events and do other things, but the difficulty is honesty is a huge part of being a police officer. So in the resignation aspect, Commissioner Strand, you are basically reinstating him in a sense that he can be a police officer anywhere he wants to be. They wiped out any process that has said he did not do the right thing. And so this, to me, there was not political motivation and there was no improper considerations. Civil service did its job, and that's what we either affirm or not affirm. And Commissioner Pepcorn, yes, you can allow him a resignation, but the reality is he was offered every opportunity to work for the police force. He was given every opportunity to get treatment for his medical condition, and still he was having difficulty at time doing it. So I would be voting no on this recommended motion.
Mayor, I have a question.
Commissioner Strand.
Thank you. I'm not certain this is germane, so guide me if it isn't. But as I recall, we've had, in my term, one other appeal of a law enforcement officer's release from his job. Can somebody remind me, because that case went further, and I think it went to court, maybe, or there were other actions after our action that seemed to counter what we had decided. Could somebody remind us of that?
Fire officer. I think Joe is our fireman that we fired.
I can address that. The post board in that incident did not revoke the peace officer license, and nor did the post board do that in this circumstance. So Officer Nachtillo retains his license as a peace officer with the state of North Dakota at this time.
If he's terminated, would that continue?
That would continue, that's correct.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Preston.
I do think it's important to separate the licensing process, which I believe that's what you're referring to, and a performance issue process, which is what we're trying to deal with.
At this point, because it's termination, you would not interfere with his ability to be a police officer because the board has allowed him to do that. So termination does not harm his employment possibilities. Any other discussion? Roll call vote.
Pepcorn?
Aye.
Strand?
Yes.
Preston?
No.
Mahoney?
No. Now I seek another motion. Is there a motion?
I'll make a motion to uphold the civil service decision.
Motion one?
Yeah.
Is there a second?
Second, for the sake of seconding it.
Discussion.
Mayor, what happens if we have a tie?
I would almost believe we'd have to table and come back later with with our commissioner back in session with us, and he would either have to watch a video of this hearing so he'd know what his transgressed or gone on during this time. Nancy, would that be, I mean, if we go to 2-2 tie, is it, we're stuck, right?
I am going to refer you to Mr. McLean on the procedure question. Thank you.
If the city commission today cannot pass a motion, the civil service commission would be upheld. Now, the city commission could come back with 5 commissioners. I suppose that's a possibility, but typically if you don't have a motion, then the action below the level just stays. So the termination would stand.
Any further discussion? Roll call vote?
Preston?
Aye.
Strand?
No.
Pepcorn?
No.
Mahoney?
No. Is there any other motions the commission wants to do today?
So as I'm clear, Mayor, bear with me, hearing what we just heard, if no action comes forth from today's meeting, everything is resting upon the shoulders of the decision of the Civil Service Commission. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean, Officer Navratil would obviously have the right to appeal that to the district
That
court.
was my next question. That doesn't end this all necessarily, does it? Or would it? Or wouldn't probably?
Can I ask a question
Commissioner
for
Preston.
clarification? So the fact that this last motion went down 3-1, that does not necessarily negate what Civil Service Commission did.
Correct. This commission took no action today.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Mayor, I don't understand. The motion was to uphold the Civil Service Commission determination. The motion failed, 3-1.
Yeah.
2-2.
No, the last vote was 3-1.
You voted no?
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to vote yes.
Oh, I was wondering.
You had made the motion for motion 1, and that would have been I would have been yes on that. So that's 2-2. I'm sorry. I thought that's where we're at.
Okay, okay.
Mayor, we might need a reconsideration of that motion. Somebody in the prevailing party would have to move to reconsider it to then revote. And if it
Nobody's
was
prevailing. Or, well, I'd be prevailing if I voted no, so I would ask to reconsider.
in the majority
Yeah.
opinion. Was I in the majority opinion, I believe, with that approach?
On the last vote, you would have been in the majority, correct?
I move we reconsider that vote. Being as, I'll just move reconsideration.
I just have to vote. right?
Second.
Second. Any discussion? Roll call vote.
Strand,
Yes.
Preston,
Aye.
Pepcorn,
No,
Mahoney,
Aye. Now let's revote the first motion, which is motion number 1. Thank you.
wow.
you want a roll call?
Yeah, roll call vote. I'm sorry.
Strand,
No.
Preston,
Aye.
Pepcorn,
No,
Mahoney,
Aye. Thank you for correcting that, Leo.
So we're still in the same spot.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, no, I mean, we can adjourn. If there is no other motion coming forth, we would adjourn and it would go back to the civil service decision is what would be upheld.
Correct. Unless the city commission wants to retake this with Commissioner Garrett.
Okay?
Okay.
Any other motion? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned.